Peace and blessings, family, and welcome to ZamboniFunk on the One in Time, a podcast about celestial timing, personal sovereignty, and living where the getting is good. Thank you so much for being here. This is your boy Zamboni, your DJ for the affair, but we'll be getting down. It won't be coming up for air. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Don't forget to send it to a friend. Don't forget that you are always welcome to check out ZamboniFunk.com and become a member. If you want to check out more content like this, there's an Astro Basics course there. There's a timing guide there. There's so much more there. We also accept donations if you're into that. Don't forget to send a lovely review if you're into the content that we have here. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for funking with us. Today on the show, we have Richard Mandelbaum. Now, Richard Mandelbaum is a clinical herbalist and a teacher of botany and herbal medicine with a private practice in Southern Catskills, New York. He is a graduate of David Winston School of Herbal Therapeutics in New Jersey, as well as having studied at Rosemary Gladstar's Sage Mountain Retreat Center in Vermont and in New York City with herbalist William Lasassier. He has been a professional member of the American Herbalist Guild since 2003, served on the AHG Council Board of Directors from 2012 to 2018, served as secretary and chair of both the AHG, American Herbalist Guild Policy Committee, and the Committee for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Now, that all is from his website, which is surely accurate, but much more important to me is that Richard runs a school in New York City called the Arbor Vitae School of Traditional Western Herbalism, affectionately known as Mugwort's School of Wizardry and Wives' Tales. It's a beautiful thing, and that was where I met Richard. And Richard was an excellent teacher to me, although I was a terrible student for him. And I learned so much from him. It was in fact Richard who was the first one who let me know that what's happening with astrology is also actually happening in the sky. We were sitting around the campfire one time, and Richard bumped me on the shoulder and said, "Hey, you see those stars right there? That's Scorpio." And it blew my whole shit up. I didn't realize that you could look up in the sky and see Scorpio like that because I was kind of dumb. But that's actually what's going on here. And so Richard has been an amazing teacher for me. He's been super helpful. I really love his thought process on things. He is always coming at things from a different angle than you might expect. He is one of only two white people who I've ever known. And trust me, I have known and studied with a lot of white people. He is one of only two who has thought it was worthwhile to read Marcus Garvey. The black people who listen to this show will know what a tremendous accolade that is. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Richard.
Yeah, thank you so much, Zamboni. I'm thrilled to be here, and yeah, let's chat. Let's talk about whatever makes sense to you.
For sure. So if you Google Richard Mandelbaum herbalist, then the first thing that comes up is everybody wants to talk to you about Lyme. So how did you become the Lyme guy?
Good question. The short version of the answer is I have no idea. If you want the longer version, it's funny because I had Lyme myself. Now it's going on close to 20 years ago. It's a ways back. And sometimes people hear the narrative and they think, oh, there's a clean cause and effect story of I had Lyme. I went through a whole journey with that. Now I want to reach out and help others. And it's a good story, but that didn't happen. Really, to be honest, it came to me. Of course, what I learned, both practically, but also in terms of empathy and understanding of what someone can go through with Lyme, having my own experience with it, of course, feeds into that and informs it. But I actually never went out and said, oh, I want to work with this in a conscious way. Subconsciously, that's another story perhaps, right? But consciously, it was never a deliberate decision. But what happened is I just started seeing, one person, then another, paying more attention to it. And you get word of mouth, things start to kind of filter out. A lot of practitioners are scared off by Lyme, even if they know enough to be able to help people. So that's one concern I have, is we don't have enough people working with Lyme. And so sometimes people who are in that situation are stuck between conventional medicine that's dismissive and denying of what's happening, and functional medicine, which can be helpful but is god awful expensive and sometimes makes people go bankrupt. And there's a real need for more people to be working with Lyme and helping people. And where where we live, where I live in, New York State, we're at the epicenter. So it really just is something that evolved on itself over time, and you reach a kind of threshold, where you become known for something at a certain point, right? And then it just feeds on itself and builds on itself. And it's still not the majority of what I see in my practice as an herbalist. I work with all sorts of things, but it is probably the single biggest thing, right? There isn't one single other diagnosis, quote unquote, or condition I work with more than Lyme. And you just start to observe things when you work more carefully and slowly with people. One of the things that I do, which is common among herbalists, is we sit with people for an hour or 2 hours when we first meet them. It's not a 7 minute or 15-minute long thing. And so you really dig deeply into something. And I definitely have learned, just by observing and listening to people, some of the patterns with Lyme that I think get lost often, unfortunately. So anyway, I'm going on beyond what your question was, but it's something that just kind of happened organically, really, more than anything else.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that you really you speak there to something really important, which is the just the idea that being in the room with someone and actually being there and listening and observing and maybe smelling and just being in that room to be with a person and with whatever their condition is, it seems to strongly inform your practice. Is that right?
Absolutely. And we're in the midst of COVID, and it's been 2 years where being in person has been harder. And even if one person on one side is willing, maybe the other person isn't. So I've done a lot more over the past 2 years online, in teaching and in my practice than ever before. My preference is absolutely in person. That said, I have learned you can gain an intimacy online as well, more than I had gone in thinking about it. I was a little bit biased against it, and I think we as humans are always seeking real space, real talk, intimacy, and we can look past some of the limitations, and still find it and still create it. If even if we have a challenge of being in person, but I think more to your point that you're making is being in real space with someone, right? Real honest, trusting space with someone, whether that's online or preferably, when possible, for sure, in person.
Mm-hmm. Presence and listening.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
absolutely.
For sure. So, and so in that practice of being present and listening, that has led you along a journey with Lyme. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Oh yeah, for sure. For
Mm-hmm.
sure. Like, as an example, one of the things, and I should say I'm far from the only person to have noticed some of these things and observed them, but they do get overlooked a lot. And some of it I did have to figure out for myself, because they weren't anything that somebody was publicly talking about or had written up in a book. And one of the things with Lyme is the profound mental and emotional aspects of Lyme disease. And on the one hand, there's the stress. If you're sick, it's going to affect your emotional well-being. I personally don't believe that the body and the mind are separate from each other in the first place. I think we've just
Mm.
created that as a construct. That's we can put that to the side for the moment. But I think what Lyme is doing to our bodies and our minds is the same thing. But that said, if you're sick with anything in a serious way, particularly something that's dismissed by mainstream medicine, you're going to be more likely to have anxiety or depression or things like that, right? So that's a piece of it. But actually, the more interesting kind of pernicious and specific side of that is I started to notice in the folks I was working with Lyme that they would word things in a very specific and peculiar way that was unique. And to give more detail on that, people started, as soon as I started really listening and asking the right questions, I realized people were describing it as a form of possession almost. Like I feel it taking over my brain. I feel when it's coming on. I don't feel like myself. I'm having thoughts that are not me, right? And very specific that I don't hear when I'm working with people with, digestive ailments or even like very threatening health concerns, cancer or heart disease or things like that. It was a very strange kind of description of what was going on, and it was too consistent to ignore. But it's the kind of thing that if you just meet with someone for 10 or 20 minutes, you might never hear because you might not ask that question. And if the person doesn't feel like they're in a space that's trusting, they may never open up about either. And you can only build that with, investing in it, right? Working it a bit. Uh, and so
With presence and
absolutely,
active listening, perhaps.
absolutely. Yeah, active listening and presence. And it's interesting because one of the ways I go about approaching health is through the lens of traditional Chinese medicine. I had teachers who passed that on to me. And I find it so fascinating and so interesting. And so I'll put my biomedical hat on and look at blood work and labs and do that. And that can be helpful. But then this more energetic side, looking at what's called in Chinese medicine of patterns of disharmony. And a- and it is very much mind and body kind of melded together in one soup. There's no differentiation of like, here are mental health disharmonies and here are physical disharmonies, which is one thing that attracts me to it for sure. And there's a belief in Chinese medicine, probably true in indigenous beliefs around the world, but that the words that a person uses to describe what's happening in their own mind and body are crucial clinical clues for a practitioner to understand what's going on. That might sound obvious, but it's very different from modern Western medicine, where you're almost considered a lot of the time as an unreliable witness to your own health, right?
Mm-hmm.
So absolutely, that active listening that you mentioned, it's so crucial.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So then there's a couple of directions that I want to go here with this. And so to be clear, Richard has done a bunch of great work and done some longer podcasts and episodes and stuff like that. So if you are concerned about Lyme or something like that, and you want to dig deeply into Lyme and treatment and ways of thinking with Lyme specifically, all that information is available. But I want to use that, and that's all available on YouTube. It's free, just so easy for any of our listeners to find. But I want to maybe use that as a jump off point here. So where does Lyme come from? Why is Lyme? So I hear that Lyme is there's more of it, that it's spreading, that it's maybe becoming worse, that where is this coming from? Why is this happening now?
Yeah, great question. And there are different beliefs about that to run through. And then I'll tell you what most resonates with me. But you've got everything from theories similar to COVID that it started in a lab. People point to like military labs in Connecticut. Um, I don't, just like with COVID, what do I know? But I think there are other explanations to it. It certainly would be god awful dumb to create a bioweapon that you can't control. But god awful dumb things have been done. But
True indeed.
but yeah, yeah, we don't have to go far to find examples of that. But that said, that what do I know about that one way or the other? There are other explanations. One, of course, is that maybe Lyme has been here all along, but our immune systems are so depleted from toxins, from lack of sleep, from poor nutrition, we could run down the list, that we're more susceptible to it than people were in the past. I think there's probably some truth to that, because when I see somebody who's sick with Lyme, particularly chronic Lyme, there was often a stressor in their lives going on at the time. Something triggered it. You dig into it. Maybe not 100% of the time. I try to be careful qualifying things, but in most cases, if somebody gets sick with Lyme in a more serious way, I don't mean they just got bitten by a tick and they feel a few things here and there, but really truly sick. Often it occurred at a time of high stress in their own lives, of something challenging emotionally, and that was true for me, for sure. So I think that there's a piece of that too, is being depleted sets you up for that infection to have more impact. We see that with COVID too, right? Is anybody potentially susceptible? For sure. But look at the people who are most susceptible to being sick, whether it's COVID, flu, whatever we want to name. It's not just the infection, it's where the infection lands and how well your constitution can handle it. It's a combination of those things. But then the last thing I'd say with Lyme, which really resonates with me, is the ecological explanation for why it's spreading, because it is, without a shadow of a doubt, objectively spreading in terms of cases. We now see cases in Europe. I've had clients on the West Coast, for instance, of the US who were told by their doctors, no way you have Lyme because it's not here. And it's like, no, yes, you do. And once they got blood work, et cetera, it became super obvious. So even the CDC recognizes that it's spreading quite dramatically. The two big hotspots being the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast of the US and the upper Midwest, so Minnesota, Wisconsin, that area, but it's moving. The ecological explanation is fascinating because it just gives us pause and makes us realize that whether we like it or not, whether we dismiss it or not, we are part of ecology. And if we dismiss it, we're just going to get ourselves even deeper into a pit, right? So this is actually pretty well documented in the ecological literature. If you think about Lyme, it's spread predominantly by what are called black-legged ticks. It's a specific species of tick, sometimes referred to as deer ticks. Deer, in fact, are not the primary vector for Lyme. It's actually small rodents. So the ticks, to be clear, are not born with Lyme. They're not actually the origin of the disease, but they are the major carriers. So a tick, in other words, needs to first be infected by taking in the blood from an animal that has Lyme, and then it's going to pass it on to the next food source, right? And then it's out there in the ecosystem. These are known as zoonotic diseases, right? Diseases that originate in other species, not humans, but then kind of escape into the human population. COVID's believed to be the same thing, in fact, right? So pretty common, but more to the point, it's small rodents, particularly there's a mouse called the white-footed mouse that is kind of like a weedy species of mouse. It lives in and around humans. It tends to be thrive in ecosystems that are a bit more disturbed versus ecosystems that are healthier and more intact. And that we have many more white-footed mice than ever before when our ecosystems were more intact. And one of the main reasons for that, besides habitat disruption, overdevelopment, not thinking about how to keep ecosystems intact while we build our towns and cities and so on, which we could. We just have to design them. We just have to be more creative, right? But we could do it. But to be specific about it, one of the species, for example, that takes care of keeping populations of small rodents down are foxes. Now, we've got many fewer foxes in the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast than were here historically. And again, habitat destruction is one, but another major reason is because there are coyotes here. and coyotes will drive foxes away out of competition, right? Now, why do we have coyotes here in the Northeast? We never used to historically. They weren't here previously. We used to have wolves. But when white European colonists got here, in addition to clear-cutting forests, also killed off mountain lions and wolves, those kind of apex predators that were an important part of our ecosystem, right? So you get rid of the wolves, that creates this vacuum ecologically that was then filled by coyotes that spread here from the west and southwest. Coyotes are smaller than wolves. They're not as effective at keeping deer populations down. And of course, mountain lions are also, for the most part, gone. There's a few here and there, and hopefully they'll come back. They also kept deer populations down. But more to the point, the wolves are gone. The coyotes are now here. The coyotes are smaller enough than wolves that they compete directly with the foxes. And so there are fewer foxes, and now there are many more rodents like the white-footed mice. So climate change is also a huge issue, right? We know that Lyme is spreading also because of climate change. The ticks actually have at least one additional full cycle of reproduction each season, because we're losing our autumn, we're losing our fall. The freezing point comes much later. So a lot of the story, at least, maybe not all of it, of why this is spreading like it is really our human intervention and disruption of what were previously balanced ecosystems. And we go in and we kind of tear a piece out, and then we have this disharmony that happens as a result.
Oh man, that's so interesting. I want to pull on all of those threads. So before we can get to all of that, do you know that the ZamboniFunk Enterprise is completely user supported? I don't have a sponsorship or anything like this. So if you like what you're hearing here and you like this content, the sort of ideas that we're getting into, then your support is super helpful. If you want to send me a tip via Venmo, Cash App, PayPal, that's super helpful. All of that is ZamboniFunk. You can find it here pictured on the screen. Only use those if someone on IG got in your DMs and with my pictures and wants to send you a different email address or something like that. Don't send them money. That's a fake. That's a scam. But if you want to send me money, then please send it to this address. It's super helpful. It makes the production of this sort of stuff possible. This has been difficult and more expensive than I thought it was going to be. Another way that you can support for free without you spending $1 is by going on Spotify or Tidal or Pandora or whatever your streaming service is, and going and checking out ZamboniFunk. Check out the song Can't Help Myself. You can put it on your favorites or your liked songs. You can put it onto a playlist. Just even if you have already done that, you already know this music and like it. If you just go there and play it another time, play it 3 times right in a row, that would be super helpful to me. Just that act alone is super helpful to me. Also, feel free to like, share, subscribe this podcast. Check me out on Instagram where I do dailies and stuff like that. Check it out in all the places. Thank you so much for being here. Let's continue the show. I heard you describe the white-footed mouse as a weed. So
Yeah.
to my mind, it seems like a good definition of a weed might be an organism that thrives in a disrupted ecosystem. How do you like that?
I do like it very much. And of course, if you want to find disrupted ecosystems around the planet, go to where the humans are, right? Modern humans versus people living in a more traditional way. And yeah, it's kind of my own thing to refer to animals as weeds, but it occurred to me, we talk about dandelions, other weedy plants. That's exactly, your definition fits perfectly to where we're going to find them. Go into a mature old growth forest. Are you going to find dandelions? Not really. You're going to find them out in the disrupted areas, right? And they're doing really important work. They're keeping an ecosystem alive, and they're doing some restoration of that ecosystem in a place that is heavily disrupted. But it represents some kind of disruption in most cases that has occurred. And so just occurred to me at one point, we've got animals that fit that niche as well. And mice, rats, pigeons, right? Are kind of our animal equivalent of dandelions in many ways.
Hmm.
So it's not to blame them, right? It's us doing the disruption for sure.
Sure, sure. Yeah. Well, throughout much of my work, a lot of my writing, I sing the praises of dandelions and other weeds all the time. I consider myself a dandelion, and I think a lot with the idea that dandelions will you can pave over everything, and the dandelions love that. They will pop up through the cracks and they will just show you the world's sunniest yellow flower, and they'll grant you a wish if you like. And they're just so happy to be here, and you can't stop them from being so happy to be here. You can try and try and try to stop them. You can choke them with Roundup, you can pull them out, you can chop them, and they don't care. They still love to be here. And so I think a lot about dandelions. And so this sort of leads me to, because you are maybe an expert in Lyme and maybe have thought a lot about this idea of disrupted ecosystems and the bugs that can thrive in them, or the weedy species that can thrive in that environment. And I often think about dandelions and weeds as having something to teach us. And so I wonder if if weeds thrive, if weeds like dandelions and like lime and many other things, perhaps COVID is another example of this, if these weeds thrive in disrupted ecosystems and we also live in disrupted ecosystems, what kind of things can we learn such that we can thrive in disrupted ecosystems?
Yeah, that's really interesting. And by the way, you did call me an expert. I try not to use the E word, but that's okay.
What term do you prefer?
No, I don't know. It doesn't resonate with
Like
me as
OG,
being an
how about that?
expert in anything, but yeah,
Like,
that's cool. Yeah, you got it. Yeah, no, anyway, I'm just being silly, but yeah, it's a wonderful question. And I mean, part of me wants to push back a little bit on the question and say, do we have to? Right? I mean,
do we have to thrive?
do we have to figure out how to manage and be healthy within disrupted ecosystems versus figuring out how we don't have to disrupt so much in the first place? Because I do think it's within our capacity as humans. We are animals. We are part of this earth. We can tap into the symbiosis and mutualism that we are a part of, and even in a modern way, right? We could, wholesale think differently about a city and still have the same number of people packed into it, right? We see other species doing that, beehives. One of my nicknames or for New York City is I call it the beehive, right? So there are other
Mm-hmm.
animals that do these things. But we have that capacity, I believe, to rethink the details of how we do things so that we're not so disruptive. I think it's actually crucial that we do that with change and habitat loss. Um, I'm one of many people who feel like we're really in for it in a bigger way than we day to day acknowledge, and whether it's in my lifetime that we see it happen, or yours, or my daughter's. I think it's going to seriously hit the fan, and so we have to rethink these things.
Right. Well, I don't think you disagreed with me there. Right?
No,
You like
no, no.
if we're headed toward major disruption, the fact is that I'm going to thrive no matter what happens. My life is gonna be great, and I'm gonna succeed, and I'm gonna make great art, and I'm gonna be connected to beautiful people, because that's how I'm going to live my life, right? And whether or not there's great disruption and ecosystemic destruction and these kinds of things, habitat loss of even me. I was evicted in Brooklyn on 3 separate occasions. None of those times were due to non-payment of rent or something like that, right? This is the kind of thing that disruption of habitat. This happens all the time to lots of folks who may or may not be human. And so the fact is that we do have to live. We got to live here somewhere, some kind of
Yeah.
way, right? And I would agree that we got to think but with better ways to be in cities and to generate human hives and these kinds of things. But also in March of 2022, which is where we are right now recording this, then there is a fair bit of disruption that we have to live with, and we can see that there are examples of those who can thrive in that kind of environment.
Yeah. Yeah, I hear you. I totally agree. Yeah, it's this balance, right? We have to be present and live in the moment, and also figure out how we can tap into what's real behind the veneer of what we're being told is real.
Mm,
At the same time as we do what we can to build a different future from what it might be, right? And that's always walking in both paths at the same time. And so yeah, what you're saying totally resonates with me. And one thing I think about, to your point, is like, how can we be like dandelions? And I certainly don't want to speak for the dandelions, but I have a feeling, at least, that they are not in denial of the fact that they are part of the planet Earth in a very intrinsic, inherent way. And uh, uh, modern human society, kind of Western and Westernized, because it's far from just the Western world now at this point, but modern industrialized human life, that culture has brainwashed us, in my opinion, to be in complete disassociation with what we really are, which is not only animals within an ecosystem on the planet Earth. That's definitely true, and that alone would be a huge step forward if we just acknowledge that. Um, but that we actually are the Earth. That we are playing an ecological role every time we breathe. We're helping to keep the atmosphere of the Earth in regulation to support life. And ideally, every time we pee, we return nitrogen and other nutrients to the soil that remain bioavailable for plants and other life to pick up, right? And so on and so forth. We're so divorced from that, both literally in many cases. We just physically remove ourselves. So sometimes I recommend to students and others, like, pee outside when you can, pick the right place, but
mm,
but at right place and time. But make that connection, complete that circuit, right? Because that is a part of our role on this planet.
mm,
um, and we're so divorced philosophically from that. I really think we're all walking around, not all of us, because some people aren't, but certainly the way I was raised, this is something I had to arrive at, that we're walking around disassociated from what we truly are. And I think, Zamboni, I think that's what you're getting at as well, right? I think we're revolving like two moons around the same planet right now, right? That recognizing that uh, even in a disrupted ecosystem, even in and we could say an urban setting, but the reality is, rural settings, agricultural areas, they can be at least as much, if not more, ecologically damaging and toxic as any city can be. So it's not just one place or the other, right? But even in a disrupted place, we are still here. We are still part of the planet, and we can play a role that is helping to restore, a restorative role. And that's what those dandelions are doing, right? They're just as you described. They don't give a shit if you don't want them to grow there. They're going to do it, right? And they're aerating the soil with their nice big tap roots, and they're pulling nutrients up from further down. So when soil's really compacted, and all of the nutrition and nitrogen and phosphorus and et cetera is kind of washed away and eroded from the soil, they're helping to bring that back up from deeper down and aerate and break that up. And now worms can move in and further aerate the soil. And then, if we leave that alone, then we've got other plant life that comes in afterwards. These are like pioneers. They're pioneer species. That's an ecological term, right? And they're kind of like scar tissue on the land. So, I mean, I personally love it when I'm if I'm walking down the street and there's an abandoned lot and I see the plant life coming through, it's like, and you can do a thought process of, it wouldn't take long if we just left everything alone for just it all to become a jungle. Not that we want to, we need to live somewhere too, right? But life's always trying to come back and restore, and I think we can recognize we have that same capacity within ourselves.
Hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much. That's a really great way to think with it. So then I know that one of your favorite scholars in the world is Lynn Margulies. And I'm gonna let you've done much more reading of Margulies's work than I have, and so I'm gonna let you explain it a little bit. But I'm thinking with the idea that that ecological disruption, it then goes on to cause disease in some kind of way, and so then and then thinking also with the idea that perhaps my contraction of illness is due to my own ecosystemic disruption. If we consider my body to be an ecosystem at the fractal layer down from the Earth cosmos. So will you sort of like explain a little deeply more deeply about what's going on here, so we can sort of get to this notion of like what's really going on here as far as
Yeah.
what it is and what disharmony is?
Yeah, well, there's a lot to unpack there, but yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, so Lynn Margulies, as you said, is one of my science heroes for sure. She was a microbiologist, pretty well known in science, not well known enough, but folks can Google her and read up, and you'll see there's a lot out there. But she was a microbiologist. At one point, for a short time, married to Carl Sagan. That apparently didn't work out. But she was the premier person to promote the theory of what's called endosymbiosis, and to get more technical, endosymbiosis as the origin of eukaryotic cells. So let me unpack that. Um, uh, Eukaryotic cells are cells with nuclei, and that refers to the entire plant kingdom, the entire animal kingdom, the entire fungus kingdom. And there's also protists, which I call the taxonomical junk drawer. That's life where, like, I don't know, it's doing this like an animal, but that like a plant, like whatever, we'll put it in there. But those are the kingdoms of eukaryotic life. So we're included in that. We have nuclei in our cells. There's more we could say to unpack what eukaryotic refers to, but she was talking about how did these both unicellular, but even more so multicellular organisms like ourselves, how did this start? Like, if you look inside a human cell, just like a plant cell, where there's actually a lot more similar than different. There's a few key differences, but there's vastly more we have in common than different. How did this happen? We have all these organelles. We have mitochondria, for instance, living in our cells. Plants have them too, and those mitochondria, they're utilizing oxygen that we breathe in, right? So our lungs take in oxygen. It's circulating through our blood. It's getting to our cells. It's actually the mitochondria inside our cells that need that oxygen, and they're utilizing it as part of the conversion of glucose and amino acids and other nutrients into ATP, which is what our bodies use for energy, right? So like every moment of every day, we're needing all of this energy. So we're taking that in from the world around us. We're taking it from the food we eat. We're taking it from the air we breathe. We could get into more spiritual aspects of what we take in, but even just keeping it literally, we're consuming, we're taking in what we need from the ecosystems that we're a part of. But it's not just consuming, because we're also regenerating that ecosystem itself by what we put back out into it, right? So we put back out the carbon dioxide, the plants take that in. So it's a bigger process that's going on. That said, back to Lynn Margulies, she was looking at these cells, and she wasn't the only one, but she is credited as being the main person to look at the cells and look at things like mitochondria and say, now, wait a second. If you look at mitochondria, first of all, they have their own genetic material, right? You might have heard of mitochondrial DNA that's matrilineal, acts independently of the DNA in our nucleus. They are semi-autonomous. Mitochondria don't take orders from the nucleus of our cells. They're kind of in there doing their own thing. If we look at chloroplasts in plant cells, that's all similar for those same reasons. And she looked at this and she was like, they look like bacteria. They behave like bacteria. They look like bacteria. They have the same structure as bacteria. I think they're bacteria, basically. They're
It quacks like a
descended from.
bacterium, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so she was derided for this, right? So that's where the term endosymbiosis comes from, that our cells actually originated by different organisms, completely separate organisms that were previously independent species coming together in a symbiosis and reaching this mutualistic relationship that eventually then just started getting recreated, reproduced. Cells would divide, and we would have multicellular organisms, and it would be passed on from generation to generation. This endosymbiosis. She was derided for this. It was thought to be ridiculous. It is now considered mainstream, accepted in every biology textbook. She doesn't get enough credit as she should. Within science, within biology, she's a bit more known, but still not enough. But then, in this fascinating way, she paired up with James Lovelock, who was a climatologist. He's still alive, actually. And he was a climatologist, for instance, that was hired by NASA to help figure out if there would be life on Mars. And he looked at the gases in the atmosphere of Mars and said, no, I don't think so. Maybe there's microbes here and there, but no thriving ecosystem because it's too stable. To look for life, you have to look for instability. And that's interesting too, in a different way, right? So these two minds came together, and they were the first two to publish the landmark modern scientific theory of Gaia. Of course, the idea that the Earth is alive, that we're all related, that we're part of a larger ecosystem is ancient, right? But in a modern scientific framework, they put that forward. So for me, Lynn Margulies, I mean, Lovelock's is fascinating too, but Lynn Margulies, as someone who looked down at the cellular level, right? You mentioned fractal layers earlier. Looked down at within our cells and saw that symbiosis, and then took that to that much larger fractal layer, that one is too small for us to see and one is too large for us to see with our own eyes, right? We need instruments for both. We need a microscope for one and a telescope for the other, right? And realize that, oh, yeah, this is happening at that larger level too, so that what you think of as yourself, as a self with a capital S, as an individual, as an ego, no, you're like a mitochondria inside a cell, right? And we are playing this ecological role in everything that we do. And we can even look at the earth and see that it's behaving as an organism with all of these little organelles within it, of which we're just one. And I to me that resonates, and the more I learn, both scientifically as well as just take in existence, it resonates more and more as I get older. And I think we see this in ancient wisdom in different vocabulary. When Buddha said the self is an illusion, I think modern science is saying, yup, that's right. um,
Cool. Yeah, right. So we've gotten into some very interesting and weird territory here, right? So like, who am I in the world? Am I the world? Is the world me? Where's the line here? There's a line in there somewhere, maybe, right? But like, I don't know what it is.
yeah.
And And so it gets kind of weird. And so, but this is important when we're thinking with ecosystemic disruption and disease as being as being related. We can think of ecosystem disruption and disease as being related. Perhaps I wonder if we might be able to oppose that by saying that ecosystemic harmony might be correlated with health. Would how do you feel about that?
Oh, completely. Both without and within, right? So on all those fractal layers, we can pretend to, but we can't really separate ourselves from the ecosystems within. We could talk about our microbiome, right? Or the larger ecosystems that we're a part of. And there's no nature has not created a dividing line between those. We have pretended, we have created a construct of one that stops at our skin, right? So when we approach health, we think of it as just, what am I eating? What am I doing? But we know there's so many, just like your example of being evicted from your home in Brooklyn. Can we truly have real health in a deep way without addressing that larger ecosystem, both human and environmental, that we're a part of, and socioeconomic factors and political factors? And we're very limited if we just see it as what should I do as an individual for my own health. We have to take those steps because here we are, this is our world, so we take those steps too. But then even like that interior ecology, like the microbiome in our gut or on our skin, that's a really promising field of science, and I'm really heartened by the fact that that has helped, at least in little ways, start to nudge and push people's perception of health into a more ecological direction. It's like, oh, I'm carrying an ecosystem within me. I need to nurture that and tend that, or I will be health challenged. And that's true on that larger scale too. So yeah, I agree. I think there's a lot of, both metaphorically and literally, a lot of things we can look at in terms of ecological harmony and equilibrium to foster our own health.
Mm-hmm. And so as we think, so there's a lot here to think with, right? We've got things to think with on the super small level, the microbiotic level, and then we've got things to think with on the maybe normal sized level, where we can think about like diet and exercise and these kinds of things. And then we've got things to think about on the macro level, where we've got ecology to think about, and these kinds of things. And when we're thinking with health and disease and this kind of thing. Now, I've heard you quote the eclectic physician John Scudder in saying that disease is not its own entity, that it's not separate from health, that disease is the same thing as health. Will you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, yeah. John Scudder was a physician in the 1800s, but by physician back then, like you mentioned, he was an eclectic physician, which basically meant 95% of what he used were herbs, right? And so these were herbalists before medical schools became uniform and kind of shut that down about 100 years ago in most of the US. Um, and yeah, he wrote, just like you said, and also that disease is not something, along with that, disease is not something to be eradicated from the body. And if we think of the modern medical approach, so much of the time we're trying to kill something, cut it out, remove it, identify, the invader. There's a very military and militaristic model to medicine of like, go in there with the guns blazing, whether you're going to carpet bomb or precision, drone bomb something. You're often approaching it from that perspective. And there's a time and a place where you need to be in a bit of a fight mode. If something's coming on, you're just coming down with something, or not to be overly dogmatic about it, but the point being that if we shift our thinking and realize, when someone is ill of health, it is actually because there's an imbalance, there's a disequilibrium, and often things that actually end up being quote unquote disease are not inherently bad or wrong processes going on in the body, but rather often are completely and wholly necessary processes happening in the body for health, but they've been thrown off course or off balance. You know, for an example, for instance, we talk about cholesterol and heart disease, and we talk about bad cholesterol and good cholesterol, right? LDL being the quote unquote bad, and HDL being the good. Well, if you didn't have LDL cholesterol in your body, you'd be dead, right? So how is it bad? It's about the balance and the relationship between the two, or autoimmune disease for that matter. Uh, Actually, everybody's fully functioning, healthy immune system has an element of autoimmunity in it. We actually need that for a proper functioning immune system. It's when it gets pushed too far and then you have it firing up. And so now you have a disequilibrium. So it's not about, oh, I have an autoimmune condition. How do we eradicate it? How do we get rid of it? How do we destroy it because I have it and you don't? No, it's actually we both have it, but in you it's in balance, so there's nothing causing problems and it's playing its small role in a proper way, and something has triggered it in my body to be so in disequilibrium and disharmony that now, okay, we've got to figure out what to bring back into balance to make this all work, right? Cancer, we all have precancerous cells in our body. It's a natural part of living. Everything else being in balance, cancer would be very rare. Um, but with everything we're doing to ourselves in the world, carcinogens and other toxins, and uh, uh, an assault of free radical damage from radiation, from the foods we eat, a lack of adequate antioxidants, and immune systems that are depleted, we now are seeing rates of cancer that traditionally, historically, would never have occurred. I'm not saying it would have been non-existent, but at much lower levels. But it's not the fact that there are small little precancerous cells forming. That's natural. There's no way to avoid it. And in fact, in modern medicine, we've reached the point already where detection methods are um, kind of getting in the way, because we can detect cancer at such early stages now, but we can't distinguish yet between what's going to one day be a problem in one person's body, but be not a problem at all in the other person's body. So even with something, and just to say, I want to make sure I'm speaking with compassion. I lost my father to cancer. I know what that challenge is like. So I don't mean to at all for anyone listening to sound like I'm dismissive of how serious these things are, and how tragic they can be. But it's not the cancer itself that's the issue. It's that what allows it to grow out of control. A cancer cell here and there that your body takes care of, that actually doesn't matter, right? So that goes back to that quote from John Scudder, right? Are we trying to eradicate something from our body, or are we recognizing that what we call disease is actually part of the healthy way a body operates, but has become somehow out of balance, and it's really that we need to be addressing.
This is really interesting. Alongside the astrological symbolism that I frequently use, there are two planets in astrology that are thought of as benefic, ben meaning good, and there are two planets in astrology that are considered malefic, mal meaning bad. So those are our evil doers, right? And they generate discomfort and disharmony and discord and these kinds of things mostly via extremity. Mars is extremely hot and Saturn is extremely cold. It's by pushing to the extremes that we come into uncomfortable, challenging circumstances that feel like obstacles. Whereas the benefics, the ones that we like, the ones that feel good to us, those ones tend toward the mediation. They tend to, like, we want to hang out in this little happy medium here somewhere, right? That's what those planets tend toward. And so it's interesting to that what you're saying here, although you didn't use any of that language, it seems to speak to that same sort of concept where doing the most is the problem, not doing at all. Is that
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
so then thinking with this as, you know, so like disease is not different from health. Disease is not something to try to eradicate from the body, but instead there is a health that one can push toward, and that, and so what is that? What is health?
Oh, it's wonderful that you asked that question. That'll take us on a whole other, down a whole other philosophical rabbit hole. But I'm loving it. It's interesting because if you look at for a modern medical definition of health, especially here in the United States, uh, uh, guess what? Guess what that do you are you familiar with what the kind of modern medical definition of health is?
Absence of disease.
Exactly. It's the absence of disease. That's not a definition, right? So in other words, there is no modern medical definition of health, right? Which is telling. Some people say, "Oh, we don't have a healthcare system, we have a disease care system," right? And that's very true.
Sure.
If we
Well, if
don't
your
even have
model
a
is to
definition.
eradicate the enemy, then you do really well at describing enemies, right?
Exactly, exactly. Now, the World Health Organization, the WHO, does a little bit better with their definition of health, and they they say, absence of disease alone is not health. This is about emotional well-being and physical well-being, and having adequate food and shelter and a supportive community, right? So it gets a much more to it. But it's an interesting question to ask. Health comes from the same linguistic roots as the word whole, being whole. So what keeps us from feeling whole? What's preventing that? Uh, uh, there's a strain of a school of thought in Chinese medicine, for instance, that uh, no matter what disharmony you have or illness, there's always something that needs to be nourished. So identify what that is, because that's crucial to bring someone back to health, right? So what is it that's preventing us from being whole? And uh, that's on that's on every level, I think.
Hmm. Hmm. That's very interesting. That's very, very interesting. So, toward the end of wholeness, we can think about. I've heard you speak eloquently about this idea that what we are is people of the forest. We are bodies that are a part of the earth, that we are the earth, that we are forest dwelling creatures, and that it is for us to that the forest is for us to be in and to be around. And I've heard you describe many benefits to forest bathing. Would you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, yeah. And in my practice, I do this even very practically when I'm working with people. You know how you might go to the doctor and they might say to you, "Oh yeah, and looks like you might be pre-diabetic. Try to eat better and exercise a little more." And then they send you out the door, and it's like, okay, how helpful was that? Not very, right? I've got two jobs and I'm a single mom, and how am I going to get more exercise into my life, or I can't afford that healthy or fancy organic food or whatever it is, or I can but there's nowhere near me, or all of these factors, right, that can come into play that get ignored when there's kind of a one-off kind of quippy, like, go do that. So for instance, with forest bathing, and we could expand that further, because for some folks maybe it's the shore and the sound of the waves breaking on the shore, and right, if you don't have woods near you, you've got some beautiful place near you, and but you sometimes have to get a little creative about it. So I'll talk to folks that I'm working with, and I'll say, hey, do you do you ever go barefoot? Do you ever go into more calm environments? Are there parks or green spaces? And some of us are so much more privileged than others, right? Like in New York City, for instance, it's one of the most bifurcated cities that there are in terms of who lives near green space. In New York, you're either living in it next to a big, beautiful, wonderful park, or you got nothing. And that's racially divided and economically divided. And so it can be stark. But that said, you figure out, like, what can you do, right? What can you do and what works for your schedule? And even if it's just once a week, kind of getting to those calmer spaces, even within our cities or within our environments. And like I said earlier, people living in more rural places too, they're often just staring at that through the windshield of their car and then walking inside. They're not bathing in it any more than anybody else is. And it can be these small things like the dandelions coming up from the cracks, right? Or the ailanthus trees coming up in those empty lots, and the squirrels. And I used to take my daughter through the city just looking for wildlife, right? It's a different kind of wildlife, but it's beautiful in its own way. Um, and for me, this, I think we all need this. It's certainly a bias of mine because of how important it's been for my own health and well-being on all levels, mental, emotional, physical. But I do believe this is biologically who and what we are. We have evolved on the earth, not for thousands of years, not for tens of thousands of years, not even for 1,000,000 years, which is when we've been kind of hominid in form, sort of, starting to become what we recognize now as human. But we've been here for since the beginning of life. We've been here for hundreds of millions of years. This form that we're in now, this human form, is only the very tip of the end of a long process, and it's very temporary for our own individual lives, but also as a species, as a form of organism. This is not really, in my opinion at least, this might not resonate with everyone, but for myself, this is not what matters. We've barely been on the earth in this form, but we've been here all along. And we're constantly shifting and changing. And this form that we're in now would not have even made any sense in an abstract way. You've got aliens in a distant galaxy creating this. No, this makes sense because of Earth, because of the specific gravity of the planet Earth, because of the composition of our atmosphere, because of the plants and other animals we're co-evolving with. This is the form we have because of being in that context. So being divorced from that, we're just setting ourselves up, among other things, I think, to be god-awful lonely, right? If we just live in a world that's defined by humans, we're missing all of this that we're a part of, that we're an intrinsic part of, that's part of us. And instead, we're just seeing this tiny little sliver of the spectrum of who and what we are and saying, well, that's what I'm paying attention to. And there's so much loneliness in the world, even more so with COVID, but so much, and so much depression and anxiety, and so much, I think, pain that we can bring onto others, right? By not recognizing and seeing, without sounding too romantic about it all. Without recognizing that interconnectedness that we really do have, that our bodies don't stop at our fingertips, that this is what we're a part of. And I see it just resonate with people when I talk to them in my practice. I don't give them a big, long, boring speech like I'm doing now, but I just say, hey, do you ever get to green spaces? How does that make you feel? Almost everybody, really, we already all know it. I don't need to tell people that. They know it, they say it or volunteer it, or when I say it, it resonates immediately. And now I'm just there to problem solve with them and to support them and to recognize the significance and importance of that because we're not hearing it from the other mainstream sources. So we have to counter that. And we could get all into the science of forest bathing. We know what it does. We know it helps us in ways that are not just by being calming and reducing anxiety and blood pressure, but regulating blood sugar, regulating our immune system. Literally, the monoterpenes, the essential oils that the trees are putting out into the air, we breathe in and interact with our immune system and make sure we have a healthy regulation and production of immune cells, natural killer cells, and T cells, and so on. So there's all the science side of it, most of it out of Japan, but increasingly from other places. But then there's the intuitive, yeah, we all kind of know it side, and it's important. It's important we carve that out for ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Right, indeed. Okay, so I've heard this and I've been with this, and I the first time I heard about forest bathing was in your class, but it's true that everybody knows this. As soon as you go out to any kind of place, you can even drive past a whole lot of trees, and if you can look out and see the tops of the trees, then somebody in your group is going to be like, "Oh my, what? It's so beautiful." You know what I mean? Every time this happens. And so we already all know this, that getting into the forest, that we are from the forest, even I feel like there's an innate knowing about that. But at the same time, I know that forever people have been doing the forest, and that I come from people who are forest creatures. I myself am descended from Potawatomi people who are an indigenous group of people who come from the Great Lakes region of North America. That's an area of the world which, prior to what we might think of as climate change, it's like 5-6 months out the year, it's snow up to your chest. And my ancestors were like, this is cool, we're going to stay here. They were way harder than I am. So when it comes to forest bathing and this kind of thing, what about chiggers and shit?
Right. Yeah. And ticks, of course, come up with
Mm-hmm.
Lyme. And yeah, you don't have to do the hardcore wilderness survival immersion, right? Like, and this is true of everything. We could be talking about diet in the same way. We could be talking about exercise in the same way. Like, every little bit helps, because sometimes we put so much pressure on ourselves, and I see this in holistic health sometimes too. Things are way too perfectionistic, and it can actually be a disincentive. It can demotivate people. Like, it's like, okay, that's not me. I can't do that. I'll never reach that. And every little bit helps. So, even just taking a stroll in a city park and noticing the insects and noticing what the animals are up to, and the changes in the seasons and how the plants are responding to that. Um, so we definitely, we can take it step by step. I mean, I personally love immersing myself in the wilderness. I never did growing up. My dad, I think, instilled in me a love of nature in a little bit more of a distanced way. I think it helped form who I am looking back on it now. But he never wanted to camp. He's like, give me a bed and a shower at the end of the day, right? Even if it's a cheap motel, it's like, I'm not sleeping in a tent, And so, and nobody has to, but it can also be in steps. So I did go that route and realized, oh my gosh, there's nothing I love better than disappearing and at least pretending there's no cell signal, even if there is, for a few days, and really getting away from it. But we can do that in small ways, right? And there are natural insect repellents too.
Word up, word up. Well, that seems like a wonderful place to end it. We've been at this for over an hour already. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but thank you so much for being here and for engaging some of these weird ass questions with me.
Oh, I enjoyed it. I hope it wasn't too like heady and philosophical for folks listening, but I definitely enjoyed it. Thank you for
No,
that.
if they're listening to me, they know that heady and philosophical is on the menu. So thank you
Very good.
so much for being here. And I look forward to
Absolutely.
seeing you next time. Did
Absolutely.
we miss
Anytime.
anything? Is there anything that you wanted to like bring up, or we should absolutely shout Arbor Vitae School of Traditional Western Herbalism, which is still in session, right, in New York City.
Yeah, although the school will be moving to the Hudson Valley for next year. I'm actually stepping down as a director. I'm going to keep teaching, but I'm making some changes in my life, want to do some more writing and other things. I've been doing the director thing for close to a decade. So I'm going to keep doing my teaching and my practice, but the school's going to be moving, but it's still there. You can check it out. Yeah, and thank you for that. And yeah, I mean, maybe just in the only thing I would add to what we were saying, and maybe this is an obvious point, is for me, this is really what herbalism is about. When I talk to people about like what is herbal medicine really about, oh, is it a natural form of medicine with fewer side effects? Sure. This is what it's really about, what we've been talking about. Yeah, so I thank you for that.
Yeah, for sure. And thank you for keeping it real throughout my herbal education. Always throughout class, it was very clear that this was at the heart of the thing, even if we were gonna end up talking about a lot of science and a lot of this kind of more, the stuff that you tend to think about with when you say the word herbalism. We talked about all that stuff, and we talked about all the different plants and these kinds of things, but it was clear all along that you were deeply interested in these kinds of subjects, and that you had a lot to say about it. And I'm super looking for, if you're doing some writing, I'm looking forward to this book. It's going to be great. We're going to have you back another time so you can talk about whatever it is that you're writing about. I don't even know. This is the first time I've heard about it, but I'm super excited. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you.
Cool. Bye.
Take care.